Sterling Harrington III leaned across the leather seat, his voice razor-sharp. "Sir, your work boots are too dirty for the upholstery of this G700. If you're looking for the cleaning crew, they use the service entrance." The jet was already taxiing fast down the runway. Harvey Miller, visibly exhausted, wiped residual grease from his forehead with the back of his hand, ignoring the searing gaze of the billionaire. He took 2 deliberate steps, not toward the cabin door, but directly toward the reinforced steel partition at the front. The co-pilot emerged, scanning the instruments, and nodded firmly at Harvey. "Captain Miller, we're waiting on your clearance. Tower says we have a narrow window for takeoff." Sterling Harrington III, the man who owned the jet and the bank that financed the runway, watched the exchange with a mixture of confusion and intense displeasure. He was accustomed to deference, not defiance, least of all from a man who looked like he'd just finished a 12-hour shift in a motor pool. Sterling was 52, carved from expensive suits and inherited expectation. His public image was flawless. The disruptive tech financier, the quiet philanthropist, the man whose wealth was so vast it felt like a natural law. He spent his mornings not on conference calls, but flying at 40,000 feet, where the air was thinner and the problems of the ground felt beautifully remote. Today's flight was critical, a last-minute merger negotiation in Zurich that would solidify his control over the global data market. He smoothed the lapel of his charcoal suit, the fabric moving like liquid silk. The interior of the G700 was his sanctuary, a pressurized bubble of control. Everything had its place. The chilled Fiji water, the encrypted satellite phone, the personalized blend of Colombian coffee waiting in the galley. This strange, greasy man walking into his cockpit was an anomaly, an error in the programming of his perfect day. Yet despite the millions he commanded, Sterling was haunted by the silence in the enormous Bel Air mansion he rarely saw. 10 years ago, his daughter Eleanor had rejected his life, choosing a path of idealistic obscurity teaching in a remote corner of Oregon. She hadn't called on his last birthday. He had money, power, and the ability to move nations, but he could not bridge the 3,000 miles and the canyon of disappointment that separated him from his child. He tried to buy her things, a new car, a trust fund, but she sent them back, polite but firm notes attached. That rejection was the wound that bled internally, making every external perceived failure, like this dirty man in his plane, feel like a personal insult to his competency. He glanced at his personal assistant, Miss Hayes, who was frantically checking the passenger manifest on her tablet. "Miss Hayes, I require an immediate explanation as to why there is an unauthorized, unprofessional civilian in the flight deck of my aircraft. I paid for the best pilots in the business. I did not hire a mechanic off the street." Sterling's voice was low, controlled, but the metallic edge was unmistakable. He needed to be in control of this flight, just as he needed to control every variable in his life. The man in the cockpit, Captain Miller, was a dangerous variable. The aircraft began its rapid acceleration, pinning Sterling back against the luxurious seat, launching him toward the one destination he always failed to reach: peace. Captain Harvey Miller was 45. But the lines etched around his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands made him look closer to 60. He was not just the pilot. He was a working-class professional trapped in the rarefied atmosphere of extreme wealth. His uniform, though clean, was worn, laundered countless times in a coin-operated machine. His life was defined by exhaustion, balancing 2 full-time jobs, piloting private charters for the wealthy, and being the sole guardian of his 12-year-old daughter Clara, who was recovering from a complex bone infection that required constant, expensive treatment. Harvey lived on instant coffee and the fierce determination to keep Clara smiling. His paycheck from Harrington Aviation was his lifeline, even if the treatment he received from the owners and their entourage was often dismissive or outright rude. He was the invisible servant who held their lives in his hands, yet was constantly reminded that he was merely a tool, replaceable and insignificant. His limitation wasn't skill, it was time and debt. Every minute spent flying was a minute away from Clara. Every flight he accepted, no matter how grueling, brought him closer to the total cost of her recovery. He settled into the pilot's seat, the worn leather of the yoke familiar beneath his hands. The scent of kerosene and cold metal was comforting, a stark contrast to the overpowering expensive cologne filtering back from the VIP cabin. He quickly ran the pre-takeoff diagnostics, his eyes darting across the sophisticated avionics. He was professional, focused, cutting out the noise of his personal panic, but a flicker of something unsettled him. During his walk-around check an hour earlier, he had noticed a discrepancy, a faint, almost invisible scratch near one of the auxiliary fuel couplings on the right wing. It wasn't structural, but it was new, and it didn't look like accidental debris damage. It looked like someone had been tampering with the line, then tried to clean the evidence. He'd reported it to ground maintenance immediately, but the supervisor, eager to please the high-profile client, had simply dismissed it as superficial cosmetic damage and cleared the jet for departure. Harvey knew better. He knew the sound of a failing valve, the smell of pressurized fuel. That scratch, that minute detail, felt like a silent scream in the face of perfect safety protocols. He strapped himself in, the memory of Clara's weak but loving smile fueling a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He was ready to take off, but he was also carrying a secret weight, the belief that this pristine machine was fundamentally compromised. Let me know in the comments where you are watching this story from. The G700 was a silent bullet, slicing through the morning air as it climbed toward cruising altitude. The transition from the chaos of the runway to the smooth upper currents was always a moment of intense peace for Harvey. But today, the peace was fractured. He could feel the weight of Sterling Harrington's disdain pressing through the cabin wall. But more immediate was the physical awareness of the slight vibration in the controls that shouldn't be there. A barely perceptible tremor that his training told him was abnormal. In the back, Sterling had recovered his composure, dictating memos into his recording device, while Miss Hayes organized the presentation slides for Zurich. He was irritated by the pilot's appearance, which was a minor distraction, but his attention quickly returned to the 9-figure deal waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. He finished dictating a complex legal maneuver and finally allowed himself to relax, pouring a scotch, a morning indulgence reserved only for transatlantic flights. As he reached for the crystal glass, he caught a reflection in the highly polished wooden paneling, a momentary distortion that pulled his gaze forward. He wasn't looking at Harvey, but at the reflection of the flight deck instruments, specifically the fuel pressure gauge. It was only visible for a second before the angle changed, but what he saw wasn't the steady high pressure required for the climb. The needle flickered, a nervous dance just below the green line. Sterling had flown enough times to recognize the critical instruments, even if he didn't understand the complex mechanics behind them. He dismissed it instantly. It's turbulence. He's probably just an inexperienced pilot. He took a sip of the scotch, forcing his focus back to the contract. Meanwhile, Harvey ran a silent checklist, cross-referencing the fluctuating pressure with the minimal fuel consumption rate. The subtle vibration intensified. It was now a tiny internal throb in the fuselage. He tried to rationalize it, a sensor glitch maybe, but the memory of the scratch on the fuel coupling flashed in his mind. He reached for the radio, ready to notify air traffic control about a potential issue and request a change in altitude to reduce stress on the system. Before he could key the microphone, a sudden, sharp ping sounded from the main instrument panel, a momentary warning light for auxiliary power failure. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, but it confirmed Harvey's worst fear. The fuel system was experiencing intermittent instability. He glanced back, knowing the billionaire in the cabin was oblivious, floating in his bubble of wealth. Harvey tightened his grip on the yoke, The fate of everyone on board, including the man who had mocked his dirty boots, now rested on his ability to identify an invisible problem 40,000 feet in the air. Something was definitely about to go terribly wrong. The tiny ping was a ghost, leaving no record in the flight management computer, but it had detonated a cold certainty in Harvey's mind. The fuel line integrity was compromised. He adjusted the autopilot slightly, easing the pressure on the right engine, trying to conserve flow. He knew that the aircraft had redundant systems, but if the primary feed was failing due to tampering, the secondary would soon be under unsustainable strain. He looked over at the co-pilot, a young, earnest man named Ben, who was focused entirely on the navigation charts. Ben hadn't caught the flicker of the light, too engrossed in the lateral track. Harvey felt the heavy burden of command. If he declared an emergency now based on a single transient anomaly and a suspicious scratch, he risked his career. Sterling Harrington could easily blackball him from the entire industry, guaranteeing he'd lose the salary needed for Clara's treatment. The cabin remained serene. Harvey could hear the muffled, precise voice of Sterling through the thin door, probably discussing bond yields or geopolitical risks. They were convinced they were safe because they were rich, because they had bought the best. But wealth couldn't fix a small, malicious act. The real signal came 20 minutes later, subtle enough to be mistaken for simple turbulence. The right engine's performance indicator showed a drop in thrust output, a fractional but persistent deficit. Harvey pushed the throttle slightly forward, compensating automatically. The engine responded, but the fuel flow spiked unnaturally. This wasn't an engine problem, it was a delivery issue. He took a deep breath, the stale cabin air suddenly tasting metallic. He considered calling ground control again, laying out his theory. "I suspect sabotage on the fuel line coupling." He could already hear the condescending dismissal. They would demand hard evidence, and the only way to get hard evidence was to visually inspect the external lines, an impossibility at 40,000 feet. Harvey's fear began to morph into a quiet, urgent anger. He was not just risking his job, he was risking the lives of everyone, including the man who had just insulted him, a man who saw him as disposable. He felt the conflict tearing at him. Protect Clara's financial future, or protect these people right now. The engine gauge flickered again, the needle dipping dangerously low. He didn't have time for slow procedural verification. The silence from ground control, the calm of the passengers, the professional focus of his co-pilot, all of them were ignoring the silent countdown Harvey could hear in the humming of the failing system. He had to act on suspicion alone. Harvey pulled his hand back from the radio microphone. Contacting air traffic control meant delaying any direct action, wasting critical minutes in protocol. He needed to know precisely what was happening to the fuel coupling, and there was only one way to confirm the sabotage. He turned to Ben, his voice low and firm, overriding the engine noise. "Ben, I need you to maintain course and altitude. Engage the primary navigation override. Do not ask questions." Ben, startled by the captain's sudden intensity, nodded mutely. Harvey unbuckled his harness, the movement awkward in the confined space. He grabbed the emergency flashlight and a heavy-duty wrench from the secured toolkit under his seat. He knew the risk was suicidal. If the cabin door was opened even slightly at this altitude, the explosive decompression would destroy the aircraft. But the G700 was equipped with a pressurized service hatch, leading to a small, unpressurized equipment bay adjacent to the wing route. It was designed for ground maintenance access, never for in-flight use. He activated the cockpit door lock and keyed the intercom to the main cabin, his voice shaking slightly, but professionally controlled. "This is Captain Miller. We are experiencing technical difficulties with the starboard engine. We need to reduce cabin pressure for a brief systems check. Please remain seated with seat belts tightly fastened. This is not a drill." In the main cabin, Sterling Harrington stood up instantly, furious. "Reduce cabin pressure? What in God's name is he doing? I demand to speak to him." Miss Hayes tried to restrain him, but Sterling strode toward the cockpit door, pounding on the partition. Harvey ignored the assault. He slipped into the small, sterile galley which housed the hidden hatch. The latch mechanism was complex, requiring a precise sequence of commands to override the pressure sensors. He worked with speed born of desperation, hearing Sterling's muffled shouting increase behind the cockpit door. "He's too dirty for this jet." The insult echoed, sharpening Harvey's focus. He wasn't saving a rich man. He was protecting Clara's father. With a heavy thunk, the internal safety seal released. A blast of freezing air immediately hit the galley, dropping the temperature by 30 degrees. Harvey forced the outer hatch open an inch, fighting the suction. The roar of the jet wash was deafening, a physical wall of wind. He was looking directly out onto the dark fuselage and the massive engine nacelle. The earth a blurred blue expanse below. The air was thin, brutal. He secured the wrench to his wrist and, against all reason and protocol, began to squeeze his body into the howling, sub-zero gap. The history of the flight changed direction the moment he disappeared into the void, gambling his life on a dirty secret he had to see with his own eyes. Sterling Harrington, witnessing the entire terrifying scene through the narrow window of the galley door, froze. The sudden drop in air pressure was tangible, sharp, and terrifyingly real. Miss Hayes was screaming, clutching her chest. Sterling stopped pounding on the cockpit partition and stumbled back. He saw the empty hatch, the furious rush of frozen air, and the sheer impossibility of what he had just witnessed. The pilot, the dirty mechanic, had voluntarily crawled outside the plane at 40,000 feet. His arrogance evaporated, replaced by a paralyzing realization of mortality. This wasn't turbulence. This wasn't a minor technical fault. This was catastrophe unfolding. He rushed back to the observation panel on the cockpit door, leaning close to the glass, demanding answers from the terrified co-pilot, Ben. "What is he doing? What is happening out there?" Sterling shouted, his voice cracking, stripped of its usual authority. Ben, wrestling with the controls to maintain altitude against the now turbulent air, yelled back, "He suspects fuel tampering, Mr. Harrington. Ground maintenance cleared the jet against his recommendation. He had to go check the coupling visually." The words landed like a physical blow. Sabotage. Sterling's mind raced, connecting the dots not just to the flight, but to the merger in Zurich. His rival, Victor Thorne, was desperate to stop the deal. Thorne was ruthless, known for industrial espionage, but this was a different level of malice. This wasn't just losing a contract. This was calculated murder disguised as a mechanical failure. Sterling felt a wave of icy sickness. His billion-dollar enterprise, his future, his life, depended entirely on the man whose hands he had just called dirty. He looked at the chaos in the cabin. Miss Hayes hyperventilating, the other passengers rigid with fear, and knew his typical response of calling lawyers or firing staff was utterly useless. "Call my head of security," Sterling barked at Miss Hayes, his voice finding a desperate clarity. "Get ground control on the line. Tell them if this plane goes down, they need to trace every single person who touched that wing. And Miss Hayes," he gripped her shoulder, forcing her to look him in the eye, "find out everything about Captain Miller, his family, his finances, everything. If we survive this, he will never worry about money again. Now move." The aircraft suddenly lurched violently as Harvey, clinging to the fuselage, attempted to stabilize the compromised fuel line. The control Ben was attempting to maintain was proving insufficient. Sterling stared into the night sky, visible through the side window, realizing the profound, terrifying irony. His life was in the hands of the humblest man he knew, confronting a danger engineered by a man as rich and powerful as himself. The urgency was palpable. If Harvey failed, they all fell. Outside, the world was a blinding rush of wind and sub-zero temperatures. Harvey, secured only by his wrench strap and sheer willpower, crawled along the wing route. His fingers were numb almost instantly, his lungs screaming against the thin air. The strobe light from the wingtip illuminated the spot, the auxiliary fuel coupling. It wasn't just scratched. The small, vital O-ring gasket was clearly sliced, causing a slow, pressure-losing leak. Someone had used a surgical knife, making it look like wear and tear. Clutching the flashlight in his mouth, Harvey used the wrench to force the coupling open, a move that risked a catastrophic rupture. He pulled out the damaged gasket and, knowing he had no replacement, remembered the heavy-duty Teflon sealing tape he kept in the emergency kit, the very kit he was supposed to keep inside the aircraft. He had to improvise. Back in the cockpit, Ben screamed into the radio, "We are experiencing severe fuel starvation on the number 2 engine, requesting immediate descent and vector to the nearest emergency field." The main cabin plunged into terrifying darkness as the second engine began to sputter and die, the silence more alarming than the noise. Sterling, abandoning all pretense of authority, stumbled back toward the galley door, shining his phone flashlight into the void where Harvey had gone. "Captain Miller, can you hear me?" Sterling yelled into the screaming wind. The sound immediately snatched away. He saw a brief movement near the engine nacelle. Harvey, a silhouette fighting the wind like a flag in a storm. Suddenly, the struggling engine coughed back to life, roaring louder than before, briefly flooding the cabin with renewed sound and power. The fluctuating fuel gauge in the cockpit snapped back to the green line. Harvey had sealed the leak, albeit temporarily, using the Teflon tape, buying them minutes, perhaps hours. But the fight wasn't over. Harvey scrambled back into the service bay, collapsing, gasping for the slightly thicker air. He pushed the hatches shut, sealing them with raw effort. When he finally staggered into the galley and opened the cockpit door, his face was blue, streaked with oil and ice, his eyes wide with adrenaline. Sterling rushed toward him, not with anger, but with something akin to desperate awe. "Captain Miller, you saved us. The engine, are we clear?" Harvey leaned heavily against the bulkhead, shivering uncontrollably. "For now, Mr. Harrington," he managed, his voice hoarse. "But we are descending immediately. That was sabotage. Someone meant to crash this jet. And I know you, Mr. Harrington, you made enemies rich enough to pull this off." The confrontation wasn't about the jet's maintenance anymore. It was about the brutal, unforgiving world of power that Sterling inhabited. A world where the cost of a contract was measured not in dollars, but in human lives. Lives that Harvey, the man he called Dirty, had just risked everything to save. The G700 made an emergency landing at a small regional airport in Newfoundland. The moment the wheels touched the tarmac, the tension that had held the plane together fractured. As the ground crew rushed toward the aircraft, Harvey, physically drained, collapsed in the co-pilot seat. Sterling, emerging from the cabin, was no longer the immaculate titan of finance. His suit was rumpled, his hair disheveled, and the fear in his eyes was naked. He immediately ordered Miss Hayes to call the authorities and his private investigation team. The consequences started immediately. Within hours, the FBI and FAA were swarming the airport. The sliced O-ring and the fresh, thick Teflon tape were undeniable proof of malicious intent. The focus of the investigation turned instantly to Victor Thorne, Sterling's rival. Thorne was arrested 3 days later, his empire beginning its inevitable collapse under the weight of conspiracy charges. The price of his ruthless ambition was the loss of freedom and reputation, but the consequences extended beyond the powerful. Harvey Miller was immediately grounded pending a full review of the flight. The airline, fearing catastrophic liability and public scandal, placed him on indefinite, unpaid leave. Despite his heroism, his professional life was momentarily destroyed by the rigid demands of aviation bureaucracy and the need to cover corporate negligence. He had saved lives, but his job was gone, and with it, the steady income for Clara's escalating medical bills. Sterling, witnessing the cold reality of the system, felt a profound moral shift. He saw how easily the courage of a man like Harvey could be crushed by procedural inertia. He walked over to Harvey, who was waiting in a sterile office for his formal debriefing, looking utterly defeated. "Captain Miller," Sterling began, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual booming resonance, "you risked everything, your life, your career, because of a detail no one else would see." Harvey looked up, his exhaustion masking any triumph. "I did it for my daughter, Mr. Harrington. I need that paycheck. Now I have nothing." The admission pierced Sterling deeper than the realization of the sabotage. He saw not a dirty employee, but a desperate father fighting a battle far more complex than any merger. Sterling had lost control of his perfect image, his safety, and his scheduled life. The truth had cost him the illusion of complete security, but it had brought him a painful, necessary awareness that true value lay not in the millions he commanded, but in the integrity of the man who flew his plane. The following week, Harvey Miller was not reinstated by Harrington Aviation. Instead, he received a thick envelope delivered by Sterling's private counsel. Inside was a contract establishing the Miller Foundation, endowed with $50 million, dedicated to financing medical care for children with complex needs, starting with Clara's complete recovery, paid in perpetuity. Harvey was named the foundation's managing director. Sterling didn't offer the money as a bailout or a charity handout. He offered it as a partnership, a recognition of profound character. He realized his wealth was meaningless if it couldn't protect the dignity of people like Harvey. Sterling himself faced a harsh reckoning. The Zurich merger was delayed, and his reputation took a minor hit due to the security scandal. But the core of his empire survived. More importantly, he began to change his priorities. He started making monthly, unplanned trips to Oregon, finally forcing himself to have unscripted, genuine conversations with Eleanor, his daughter. He was learning that control sometimes meant letting go. 3 months later, Harvey stood beside Clara, who, now mobile and smiling, was throwing a baseball in their small backyard. Harvey hadn't flown a commercial jet since the incident, but he felt a stability he'd never known. He was no longer running on fumes and fear. Later that afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up. Sterling emerged, not in a suit, but in a simple, expensive jacket holding a worn, leather-bound book, an antique aviation manual. He didn't come to talk business. He came to visit. "I found this in an old military surplus store," Sterling said, handing the book to Harvey. "It reminded me that true engineering is about grit, not just polished metal." Harvey smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes, erasing years of exhaustion. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington." "Aish, call me Sterling, Captain," the billionaire corrected, looking out at Clara playing freely. He had exchanged the polished control of the boardroom for the messy, unpredictable reward of human connection. The invisible man had saved the powerful one, and in doing so, had forced the powerful one to finally see the value beyond the price tag. Harvey Miller, the single dad with the dirty boots, had not only saved their lives, but had redefined what true worth meant in the rarefied world of the ultra-rich. He had found dignity not in his profession, but in his courage. If you enjoyed this story of hidden courage and unexpected redemption, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts on Harvey's difficult choice, and subscribe for more dramatic, heartwarming tales like this one.